A couple I know recently faced this just impossible choice. His career, the one he spent over a decade building, was really taken off in one city.
Okay.
But her family, her entire support system, was 1,000 miles away in another city. And it was this single, irreversible decision, Felt like it was pulling their whole future apart.
Yeah, those are the toughest ones. No easy answer.
Exactly. No easy compromise, no middle ground. It's the kind of really high-stakes, life-altering thing that feels totally unique when you're in it. Like nothing else compares.
Sure.
But as I was thinking about it, I realized the underlying structure of their conflict, like the actual mechanics of the disagreement. It was identical to this much smaller, almost trivial problem my family used to have every single Friday night.
Oh, what was that?
Just this ridiculously heated debate over whether we were going to watch an action movie or a romantic comedy.
Ah, the classic Friday night dilemma.
Right. And in both cases, the huge career decision and the silly movie night squabble, the problem wasn't really deciding whether to coordinate. It was deciding how. Agreement was critical, but what people wanted was totally different.
That divergence of preference is key.
So today, we are diving deep into exactly this structure of conflict. Our mission is to explore these high-stakes coordination challenges using the lens of game theory. We'll look at everything from corporate alliances, massive national infrastructure projects, some real failures there, right up to the biggest global policy conflicts we face.
Yeah, and the aim is really to understand how, even with deep disagreement, people or companies or even countries eventually get forced into some kind of shared outcome.
So let's start there. You mentioned that common structure. It's fascinating that it applies to something huge like a career move and something small like movie night. Game theory actually has a name for this, right?
It does. It's a classic model called the Battle of the Sexes game, or BOY-S. It's really the formal bedrock for understanding any coordination problem, where both sides absolutely prefer doing something together rather than doing nothing or doing different things separately.
Okay.
But, and this is the crucial part, they fundamentally disagree on which coordinated outcome is better.
So just to formalize that a bit, player one wants outcome A, player two wants outcome B. But importantly, both A and B give a much better payoff than if they just go their separate ways and fail to coordinate at all.
Exactly right. The core tension isn't about cooperating versus not cooperating. It's about the clash of preferences within that need to cooperate.
Right.
So with the movie example, watching any movie together is better than sitting in separate rooms doom scrolling. But if player one really wants the action flick, outcome A, and player two is set on the rom-com, outcome B, you get that classic BOY-S friction.
And the tension comes because if player one picks the action movie, player two, even though they wanted the comedy, would still rather watch the action movie together than watch nothing, right?
Yeah, precisely. Player two would rationally choose A in that scenario, even though B was their first choice, because breaking coordination is the worst outcome for both.
Okay, so let's unpack this using like standard game theory thinking. If both people are perfectly rational, they know the payoffs. Can they just calculate the best outcome? Does the math give a single answer?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting, and why the BOY-S model is both powerful and kind of problematic on its own. Classic game theory often fails to give you one clear prediction here.
Really? How so?
The game typically has two pure Nash equilibria. And remember, a Nash equilibrium is a state where neither player can do better by just changing their own strategy, assuming the other player stays put.
Okay, so in the movie case, the two Nash equilibria are: one, they both watch the action movie, and two, they both watch the romantic comedy.
Exactly. Both are stable outcomes. If they end up watching the action movie, player two isn't thrilled, but they'd be even less happy watching nothing, so they stick with it. Neither person has an incentive to unilaterally switch.
I see the problem.
Yeah. The issue is that classic game theory, just looking at the payoff matrix, gives you no mechanism inside the model to predict which of these two perfectly acceptable, stable outcomes will actually be chosen.
So it creates this ambiguity problem if you're trying to use the model to predict what happens in the real world.
Precisely. It's an unambiguity problem. How do you know which equilibrium society or the couple or the companies will land on?
Which kind of invalidates the model for prediction unless you add something else, right? It's like saying, here are two equally good roads, but you still have to pick one to actually start driving.
That's a great analogy, and it leads researchers to look at things like mixed strategies, where players might randomize their choices to, like, flip a coin.
Does that work in reality?
Well, mathematically, there's a mixed strategy equilibrium, but the expected payoff you get from randomizing is often significantly lower than either of the two coordinated outcomes. So think about it. Real-world players facing big coordination costs, like companies deciding on a tech standard, they rarely resort to actually flipping a coin when there's a better, certain outcome available if they could just agree. They want one of the good outcomes, not the mathematically stable but kind of mediocre middle ground.
Okay, so for the model to actually tell us something useful about the real world, whether it's companies or countries or couples, we have to look outside the math, outside the payoff box itself. We need something to break the tie.
Absolutely. To resolve that ambiguity and make the model predictive, the players have to rely on information that's external to the game matrix. This is where things like convention, history, communication come in.
Like social norms.
Exactly. Thomas Schelling's idea of focal points is really key here. A focal point is some kind of shared expectation, maybe a pre-existing norm, or just common knowledge that makes one strategy suddenly seem more obvious or salient than the others.
Can you give a more concrete example?
Right.
Beyond just, they did it this way last time.
Sure. Think about tradition. If, say, for the last 5 years, player one always got to pick the movie genre on Friday nights, that tradition itself acts as a powerful focal point. It pushes the outcome towards player one's preference, even if player two grumbles.
Okay, that makes sense.
Or think about urgency. If a decision has to be made in the next 5 minutes, and one option is just more visible, maybe player one has already queued up the trailer for the action movie, that sheer visibility can act as a coordination device. It's a nonverbal signal of intent.
So it becomes the path of least resistance.
In a way, yes. For bigger conflicts like international ones, historical precedent, or maybe the authority of an institution often serves this role, making one coordinated outcome seem more legitimate or just inevitable than another.
Right.
And this reliance on these external factors, these focal points, is absolutely critical for understanding how real-world coordination problems actually get solved. Because without them, the game just stays stuck, theoretically indeterminate.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. We're moving from the clean math of the conflict to the messy reality of history, context, power, all that stuff.
Exactly.
And speaking of messy reality, let's transition from these models to a really high-cost, irreversible example of coordination failure.
Right.
I'm thinking about standardizing massive national infrastructure, specifically railway track gauges. This feels like a ball-and-S game played out over whole continents for decades.
Oh, it's a textbook example. Absolutely.
Yeah.
It perfectly illustrates how focusing on short-term costs, on individual preferences, can completely blind decision makers to the huge long-term negative consequences, the externalities. The stakes here went way beyond personal preference to fundamental economic efficiency and public utility.
And Australia is often held up as the prime example of getting this wrong, isn't it?
Yeah.
They ended up with this patchwork system, 3 main incompatible lines. The standard gauge, 4 foot 8.5 inches, a broader one, 5 foot 3, and a narrow one, 3 foot 6.
That's right, a triple gauge dilemma.
And the story you often hear, the simplified version, is that it was all down to 2 stubborn engineers, one Irish, one English, each insisting on the gauge used back home.
Yeah, that's the common narrative. It's simple, maybe politically convenient, but it really misses the mark. It ignores the much more complex political and, crucially, institutional failures that were actually at play.
So it wasn't just 2 guys arguing.
Not at all. The decisions were made, or rather not consistently made, by legislative bodies, by colonial governors, even with guidance coming from the British government back in London.
I remember reading about Earl Grey, the British Secretary of State for the colonies. He actually tried to impose a standard early on.
He did. Back in 1848, he recommended the 4 foot 8.5 inch gauge for uniformity across all British colonies. He was essentially trying to provide a global focal point, a standard solution.
But it didn't stick.
No. Political realities and economic priorities on the ground quickly fractured that intention. The governor of Victoria went ahead and chose the broader 5 foot 3 inch gauge, creating the first major break.
Okay, so that's 2 gauges already. Where did the third one, the narrow gauge, come from?
That came later when colonies like Queensland and South Australia opted for the 3 foot 6 inch gauge. And this decision was rooted in a very pervasive, though often poorly justified, economic belief at the time.
What was the thinking there? Why go narrower?
Well, the conventional wisdom, the simple calculation everyone seemed to accept, was that the cost of building a railway was roughly proportional to how wide the track was.
Cheaper to build narrow.
That was the idea. For colonial governments and investors trying to minimize the initial outlay, the first cost, and extend track quickly into new territories, a narrow gauge looked really appealing. They argued, for instance, that a 3'6" line would cost only about, say, 74% of what a standard 4'8.5" line would cost.
So each colony was optimizing for its own immediate budget.
Exactly. They were chasing the lowest immediate investment cost, completely ignoring the massive future costs of incompatibility that would hit once trade between colonies started to grow. They were solving their own local bias problem in the cheapest way possible without considering the continent-wide game.
Okay, so they ended up with this fragmented system. What were the actual tangible economic consequences for Australia? You mentioned externality.
Oh, the consequences were huge, debilitating, really. They deeply affected the national economy. You had enormous congestion at the junction stations, the places where the gauges broke. Imagine trains arriving and everything having to be unloaded and reloaded onto different trains.
Just pure bottleneck.
Pure bottleneck.
Yeah.
And then there was the capital cost. Needing to maintain separate sets of locomotives and rolling stock for 3 different gauges across the continent, that meant excessive capital tied up, huge operational complexity.
And the actual movement of goods must have been a nightmare.
It was an operational disaster. Every time goods crossed a border between gauges, say, from standard gauge New South Wales to broad gauge Victoria, everything had to be manually transshipped.
By hand.
Often, yes, or using specialized cranes. This added huge working expenses, caused constant delays, and critically led to goods being damaged or even stolen during the transfer process.
Right, opportunity for theft there.
Definitely. Plus, you needed separate repair shops, separate teams of skilled staff trained for each different gauge. The sheer inefficiency piled up. By the late 1880s, the debt and interest payments generated by these fractured, inefficient railway systems were becoming a major source of economic instability.
Wow. And you mentioned earlier that this wasn't even based on solid analysis.
That's perhaps the most damning part. Rigorous economic or technical evaluations actually comparing the different gauge options, properly weighing the upfront savings against the long-term costs of incompatibility, they were often completely missing in the Australian colonies for decades after these initial decisions were made.
So it was just local preference and flimsy cost estimates.
Pretty much. Political whim, maybe some engineering preference, and these very simplistic cost ideas drove the process, not disciplined cost-benefit analysis that looked at the whole system. It was a massive coordination failure born from institutional inertia and a focus on immediate local costs.
Okay, so that's Australia, a failure through fragmentation. Now let's contrast that with the United States. They started with even more chaos, didn't they? But somehow managed to standardize.
They did. The U.S. in the 1830s was a wild west of gauges. At least 23 distinct ones were operating initially. It was complete fragmentation.
23.
Yeah. But by the 1860s, it had largely consolidated into 2 dominant clusters. You had the 4'8.5" gauge, or sometimes 4'9", which was compatible enough, concentrated in the Northeast and Midwest. And then you had the 5-foot broad gauge, which was predominant across the South.
So still 2 major incompatible standards dividing a rapidly industrializing nation. That must have been a huge drag on the economy, too.
Absolutely crippling. And the costs weren't static. They were growing right alongside the volume of trade between the North and South by the 1880s. Contemporary accounts paint a vivid picture of the inefficiency at the gauge breaks.
I like that.
One observer wrote something like, "Not a prominent point could be found on the border of the South without its hoist and acres of extra trucks," meaning you needed huge, expensive setups, cranes, extra railway cars waiting just to manually transfer goods across that incompatibility gap. It was a massive physical barrier to a truly integrated national network.
So how did they fix it? Especially if politicians had been struggling with this for decades. It happened very suddenly in 1886, didn't it?
It did, and this is where the necessary external solution came not from government decree, but actually from private industry power, specifically through coordinated action.
Coordinated action by whom?
By the Southern Railway and Steamship Association, the SRSA. It was essentially a cartel of Southern railway companies.
A cartel. Interesting.
Yeah. They planned and executed this incredible simultaneous conversion over just 2 days, May 31st and June 1st, 1886. Something like 13,000 miles of southern track were converted from the 5-foot gauge to the standard compatible 4-foot 9-inch gauge.
13,000 miles in 2 days. How?
Meticulous planning. They had crews ready all along the lines. Traffic was halted very briefly. One rail was shifted inwards by 3 inches, respiked, and then traffic resumed, seamlessly crossing those former breakpoints. It was a really stunning logistical feat, a massive coordination success achieved by a private entity.
It seems so counterintuitive, though, that a cartel, which we usually think of as anti-competitive, was the force needed to achieve this huge public good of standardization. What was their main motivation? Was it public service?
Not primarily, no. The SRSA's main organizational goal was, frankly, to eliminate competition among its members. They were very effective at setting up and enforcing non-competitive pricing through rate agreements.
Okay, so they were fixing prices.
They were. Now, the standardization itself was economically beneficial for the railways themselves. Getting rid of those costly interchange points, the hoist, the extra labor, it significantly reduced their operating costs for all rail shipments. They basically internalized the economic benefits of compatibility that had previously been external costs.
Right, but being a cartel that controlled the freight, they didn't exactly have an incentive to pass those savings on to the people shipping the goods, did they?
Precisely. That's the critical tension here. The conversion dramatically lowered their operating costs, but the SRSA cartel pursued a strategy of holding freight rates constant right through the conversion period.
You can actually see that in the data.
Yes. We can see it from their internal communications, their circular letters, and the actual rate data. The vast majority of freight routes show absolutely no change. A $0 change in the price immediately after the physical conversion happened.
Wow. So the collusion, the cartel structure, was the external force required to solve the bile-esque coordination problem among all those different Southern railway owners.
Yeah.
They all agreed on the standard gauge, outcome A.
Yes, they forced the coordination.
But that same mechanism, the collusion itself, then prevented the efficiency gains from being passed on to the public as lower prices.
Yeah.
It limited the overall welfare gain.
Exactly. It highlights this fundamental tension in networked industries. Getting the necessary standardization often requires some kind of power structure, maybe government, maybe private collusion to overcome the deadlock. But that very power structure can then capture the benefits for itself.
It's a really profound political and economic point. Standardization in these high-stakes coordination games often needs a push, some mechanism to force the choice of one equilibrium. But who provides that push dictates who ultimately benefits.
It's a dynamic we see again and again.
Okay, so let's shift focus a bit now. Let's move from physical networks like railways to the world of corporate strategy, specifically strategic alliances. Here, the coordination problem isn't about track width, it's more about organizational alignment, right?
Wow.
But we're still dealing with that same fundamental BOS structure.
Absolutely. When we talk about strategic alliances, we mean long-term cooperation, where companies work together but stay legally independent, they become mutually dependent. It's different from a full merger, but it still requires significant integration to actually work.
And success hinges on achieving different kinds of fit between the partners.
That's right. It starts with the strategic fit. That's the basic reason for the alliance in the first place. Maybe it's about sharing risk on a big project, or maybe accessing complementary resources, like one company having great tech and the other having market access. That's the why.
Okay, the raison d'etre.
Exactly. But once you have that strategic justification, the really hard part begins, negotiating the terms of the alliance. And these terms are where the coordination choices really happen.
What kind of terms are we talking about?
Oh, all sorts. Agreeing on a shared management style, choosing which technological platforms to use, figuring out control rights, setting operational procedures, even how to integrate human resources. These are all classic BOS decisions. Both firms prefer having an agreement over no agreement, but Firm A might strongly prefer the agreement that uses its existing technology, while Firm B really wants the one that aligns better with its established corporate culture.
This sounds like a perfect place to bring back that idea of procedure mattering. When you have multiple partners trying to agree on all these complex points, does the order in which they negotiate things actually change the final outcome?
It absolutely matters. It can introduce a significant bias. Research using what's called procedure model confirms this. When you're negotiating these complex multi-issue agreements, the specific process you follow influences where you end up.
So what's the difference between, say, tackling everything at once versus step by step?
Well, you can compare a simultaneous procedure where all issues are on the table at once versus a step-by-step procedure where you resolve things sequentially.
Okay.
In the simultaneous approach, firms tend to bargain hard and stick closer to their ideal positions on all issues. The final outcome often looks like a compromise somewhere in the middle, kind of equidistant from where everyone started.
Right, like splitting the difference.
Sort of, but in the step-by-step procedure, it's different. Firms reach partial agreements along the way, and those partial agreements then act as anchors or new focal points that constrain the negotiations in the later stages.
Ah, so the decision you make in step 1 limits your options or biases the outcome for step 2 and step 3.
Precisely. Simulation studies show this clearly. Unless the problem is very simple, the different procedures generally lead to different final agreements. The step-by-step method often ends up favoring whoever gets their preferred option locked in early.
The first mover advantage, maybe, or the more powerful player.
Exactly. If a partner can secure a partial agreement that's closer to their ideal early on, it shrinks the bargaining space for the other partner down the line. It demonstrates that the path you take to agreement literally influences which bias equilibrium you land on.
That idea of the powerful partner leads us straight into the issue of power dynamics. In the basic Bagares model, we kind of assume the players are equal. But in the real corporate world, alliances are rarely perfectly balanced, are they? Dependency isn't usually symmetric.
Dependency is absolutely the key differentiator in real-world alliances. Partners very seldom have the same level of need for the alliance to succeed. This creates dominated alliances where one partner is much more reliant than the other.
And this shifts the game.
It shifts it away from a pure coordination game towards something more like a hybrid game, one whose nature can even change over time. Power, in this context, really comes down to how much a firm needs the alliance compared to its alternatives outside the alliance.
And that power balance can shift, even if the market doesn't change drastically.
Oh, definitely. Often it shifts due to what's called differential learning. If one partner, usually the one starting in a stronger position, the dominant one learns faster or acquires critical knowledge from the alliance more quickly than the other.
Like manufacturing techniques or market insights.
Exactly. Intangible resources like that. As the dominant partner learns, its dependency on the alliance decreases. It needs the other partner less. This sharpens the power imbalance significantly. A partner who figures out they can now go it alone has much less to lose by pushing for terms that favor them. They might even become opportunistic.
So the outcome isn't really a negotiated agreement between two options anymore. It's more like forced compliance towards the dominant partner's preferred equilibrium.
That's often what happens.
Let's make this concrete. The Rover-Honda alliance is often cited here, right?
Yes, the relationship between the UK's Rover Group and Honda is a classic, maybe tragic, illustration of a highly dominated alliance. Rover was fundamentally critically dependent on Honda.
For survival, basically.
Pretty much. They desperately needed Honda for financial stability and, crucially, for access to modern car designs and efficient production methods, which they lacked. Honda, on the other hand, viewed the alliance much more strategically. For them, it was largely a way to learn a vehicle to understand the complexities of the European car market before potentially entering more fully on their own.
So as Honda gained that market knowledge, their dependency on Rover plummeted and their power just shot up.
Exactly. And in that environment of extreme inequality, Rover's strategic options just evaporated. Honda started adopting increasingly opportunistic strategies. They dictated unfavorable contract terms.
Like what?
For instance, they forced Rover to buy and use Honda-made components in Rover cars. They dictated production mandates for specific vehicle models, even pushing Rover towards building more luxurious cars that didn't really fit Rover's traditional market niche or capabilities.
But if the terms were becoming so bad for Rover, why didn't they just walk away? Threaten to end the alliance?
Because for Rover, the alternative non-coordination, dissolving the alliance, was unthinkable. It likely meant financial collapse, complete failure to keep up technologically. In the payoff structure of their specific Bar S game, Rover was essentially forced to choose the coordinated outcome that Honda preferred, outcome A, even if it offered Rover a very low payoff, because the payoff for non-coordination going bust was infinitely worse.
So their only rational move was to comply.
Sustained compliance became the only rational choice for the highly dependent partner, even as Honda squeezed them harder. It perfectly illustrates how a significant power imbalance effectively resolves the coordination ambiguity. It just eliminates the possibility of the weaker partner getting their preferred outcome.
So whether we're talking about a cartel strong-arming railways into using a standard gauge in the U.S. South, or a dominant partner like Honda dictating terms to Rover, it seems like some kind of outside force, collusion, power imbalance, even procedural bias is often needed to push the outcome towards one of the two stable but different options in a bar-esque game.
That pattern holds surprisingly well.
And it seems like this pattern carries through all the way to the biggest challenges we face, like global policy coordination. Which brings us, I think, to our final section, applying this to something like climate change policy.
Right. Climate change is arguably the ultimate coordination challenge. It's multi-scalar, involves nearly 200 sovereign nations, all with deeply conflicting economic interests and priorities. It looks like a massive, incredibly complex, high-stakes battle of the sexes game.
And traditionally, the go-to model for thinking about this has often been the tragedy of the commons, hasn't it?
Yes, very frequently. The Taghi model, in essence, predicts failure. It posits that when you have a shared, limited resource like the atmosphere's capacity to absorb greenhouse gases, rational actors, whether individuals or nations acting purely in their own self-interest, will inevitably overuse and deplete that resource, leading to disaster for everyone, unless some external force like strict regulation or privatization intervenes.
It basically predicts coordination failure is the default.
That's the core assumption. But there is a significant philosophical critique of applying the Taghi model too readily or exclusively to climate change. The risk is that it becomes what some call a performative model.
Performative, meaning it makes itself true.
Sort of. It risks becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy of failure. By framing the incredibly complex system of international relations and diverse national economies within this one rather simplistic framework, the Taghi model can sometimes obscure or ignore important complexities.
Like what?
Like the real potential for innovation or the fact that the costs of mitigation might not be uniformly high. Some actions might even have near zero or negative costs, co-benefits. It can downplay the possibility of cooperation emerging through other means.
This sounds related to that idea of theory roulette or underdetermination you mentioned earlier.
Exactly. Underdetermination means that for complex situations like climate change, there isn't just one single correct theoretical model. Multiple models, tragedy of the commons, maybe evolutionary game theory focusing on reciprocity, or institutionalism focusing on regime building, perhaps behavioral economics looking at heuristics could all potentially describe aspects of the situation. None might be perfectly true.
So choosing which model to use isn't just an academic exercise.
Not at all. Because the outcomes are so uncertain, the time frame's so long, choosing which model to communicate, to use for analysis, to base policy discussions on that becomes a deeply pragmatic, even political decision. That's the theory roulette. You place your bet on a particular way of framing the problem.
Okay, so if we take seriously the critique that the 2C model might be performative, that constantly framing climate change as an inevitable tragedy makes coordination failure more likely, what does a pragmatic, precautionary approach suggest?
Well, if you build a simple decision matrix and you accept the possibility that the 2C framing is self-fulfilling, then a precautionary stance leads to a fairly clear conclusion.
Which is?
The dominant choice, pragmatically speaking, is to not rely solely or primarily on the Taghi model for communication and policy framing.
Why is that dominant?
Because if Taghi is performative, avoiding it delays the potential apocalypse by reducing the risk of that self-fulfilling prophecy. It keeps the door open to alternative pathways. And if Taghi isn't performative, well, using other complementary models doesn't necessarily hurt and might offer useful insights anyway. So avoiding over-reliance on Taghi minimizes the maximum potential regret, if you like.
So it's about keeping options open psychologically and analytically, allowing space for insights from other fields.
Exactly. It opens the door to focusing on insights from other behavioral sciences. How do we find or create focal points for cooperation? How do we design robust institutions that can manage conflicting preferences? It shifts the focus towards actively building coordination rather than starting from an assumption of inevitable failure.
Okay, so instead of defaulting to a model that basically predicts doom, the idea is to use framework that at least allow for the possibility of successful coordination, however difficult.
That's the pragmatic argument.
And in the real world, we actually see attempts to build exactly those kinds of coordinating structures, don't we? Through things like the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, and the Paris Agreement.
Precisely. These international agreements and the institutions they create are real-world attempts by political leaders to solve this massive global BITIS coordination problem.
Yeah.
You have sovereign nations, all with their own conflicting economic preferences, developing nations prioritizing growth, developed nations maybe focusing more on emissions cuts, resource-rich nations with other interests again.
A huge mix of preferences.
Huge mix. But they've come together to create institutions specifically designed to try and reach consensus, to find and implement a shared, coordinated outcome on climate action.
So structures like the Conference of the Parties, the COP meetings, these are essentially the politicians trying to build that external framework needed to pick a cooperative equilibrium in this giant game.
In essence, yes. They are trying to build the mechanism to solve the ambiguity problem that's inherent in the BOAS structure when you have nearly 200 players. The COP, for instance, has been given surprisingly broad authority over time to flesh out the details of the treaties, giving it political leverage to nudge countries towards specific coordinated actions.
And crucially, these institutions try to tackle the economic conflicts head-on.
They have to. A purely environmental agreement with no consideration for economic development would simply be rejected by a large part of the world. So these institutions explicitly try to integrate environmental and developmental issues right from the start.
How does that work financially? How do they try to bridge the gap between, say, rich nations who might prefer stricter targets and poorer nations who need resources to adapt or transition?
The financial mechanisms are absolutely critical. They've set up a complex structure, including major bodies like the Green Climate Fund, GCF, and the Adaptation Fund.
What's their role?
They serve a dual purpose, really. First, they act as a concrete signal of commitment from wealthier nations, a kind of focal point signaling seriousness. Second, and more practically, they provide a means to help ensure that less wealthy nations can actually afford to choose the cooperative, climate-friendly path, rather than being forced by economic necessity down a less sustainable route. And there are interesting institutional design choices there, too. Take the Adaptation Fund, for example. It was specifically set up to be funded not just by voluntary contributions from developed countries, which can be unreliable, but through a small levy on projects under the Clean Development Mechanism, CDM.
So it had its own funding stream, somewhat independent of political whims.
Exactly. That structural autonomy was a deliberate design choice aimed at trying to overcome some of the deep political conflicts around funding commitments and reliability. It shows leaders actively trying to engineer robust, non-ambiguous mechanisms to facilitate long-term coordination, addressing the core BIRS challenge.
This has been a really fascinating journey, actually, pulling this single thread, this coordination problem, through so many different scales.
It's a surprisingly universal structure.
Yeah, the unifying pattern we've really seen is that at almost every level of human interaction, whether it's a couple deciding where to live, or how my family pick a movie on Friday night, or how nations try to manage a global crisis, it involves solving this core coordination problem. The difficulty, as we said at the start, isn't usually if we should coordinate. It's almost always how do we coordinate when we want different things. And the how, it seems, often needs some kind of external push or structure.
And I think what this deep dive really highlights is that the resolution, whether we're talking about standardizing railways or setting the terms of a business alliance or forging international climate policy, it very rarely comes from just a purely rational calculation of initial costs, like classic game theory might initially suggest.
Right. It's messier than that.
Much messier. Instead, resolution seems to require massive institutional effort or building strategic consensus, which, as we saw with the railways, is sometimes achieved through less savory means like collusion or the exercise of raw power by a dominant player. Or sometimes it just takes sheer political necessity to force actors to overcome their deeply entrenched, different preferences and finally converge on that single common point of agreement. Standardization, coordination, it's not just an economic or technical puzzle. It's fundamentally a historical and political process.